Have you ever noticed how a home can feel peaceful one moment and heavy the next, even though nothing visible has changed? And have you ever wondered why some houses feel warm and protected while others, though beautiful and well-furnished, feel tense, restless, or cold? Because Padre Pio warned that the atmosphere of a home is not shaped first by furniture, money, or location, but by words. And he insisted that words are not empty sounds, but carriers of spiritual weight that either invite grace or give access to darkness. And this truth is not poetry or exaggeration, it is spiritual law. Because Scripture itself tells us that life and death are in the power of the tongue, and Padre Pio, who spent his life hearing confessions and discerning souls, saw the concrete consequences of careless speech in families who came to him broken, confused, and under spiritual pressure they could not explain. He often said that many people spend years praying for peace while unknowingly destroying it every day with their own mouths, because words spoken repeatedly do not disappear. They settle, they linger, they shape habits, emotions, and even spiritual openness. And when a home becomes accustomed to certain expressions, those expressions begin to define what is normal, what is tolerated, and what is invited to stay. Padre Pio explained that a Christian home has what he called a spiritual immune system, much like the human body. And just as certain substances weaken physical immunity, certain words weaken spiritual protection, creating small openings that the enemy patiently exploits over time, not through dramatic possession, but through confusion, division, discouragement, and loss of peace. This is why he warned families to take their language seriously, not only public speech, but the private words spoken behind closed doors in moments of anger, frustration, exhaustion, or sarcasm, because these are the moments when the tongue reveals what truly governs the heart. He reminded parents that children learn faith not only through prayers and religious education, but through tone, reaction, and everyday speech, because a child absorbs atmosphere before theology, and when harsh or destructive words become common, the child grows in an environment where fear, shame, or aggression feels normal, and this normality becomes the soil in which future struggles grow. Padre Pio was especially firm with adults who excused their words by saying they did not mean them, because he taught that meaning does not cancel impact, and that the spiritual realm responds not to excuses, but to what is spoken and sustained. And he warned that the enemy does not need perfect hatred or deliberate malice. He only needs permission through repetition. He observed that many families did not collapse suddenly, but eroded slowly through patterns of speech that hardened hearts, weakened respect, and made reconciliation more difficult with time. And he said that once a word is spoken, it cannot be taken back, but it can be healed by repentance, humility, and replacement. Because God's mercy is always greater than human failure, yet mercy requires cooperation. This is why Padre Pio never stopped at warning alone. He always pointed toward restoration, teaching that the same mouth that wounds can heal, the same tongue that curses can bless, and the same home that feels heavy can become light again when language is purified and intention is corrected. He emphasized that this purification does not happen overnight through willpower alone, but through awareness, discipline, prayer, and deliberate substitution. Choosing blessing when insult feels easier, choosing silence when anger seeks expression, choosing prayer when frustration demands release. He reminded families that silence can sometimes be holier than speech, and that restraint is not weakness, but strength under control, a sign of maturity in faith. Padre Pio also warned that modern culture trivializes speech, encouraging people to vent, express everything, and justify verbal aggression as honesty. But he insisted that not every thought deserves expression, and not every emotion deserves a voice, because wisdom discerns what builds and what destroys. He taught that holiness begins not with grand acts, but with small fidelities, including fidelity of speech, because words shape habits, habits shape character, and character shapes destiny. When he spoke about homes troubled by constant arguments, anxiety, or rebellion, he often traced the root not only to external stress, but to the internal language of the family, words spoken in jest that carried contempt, words spoken in anger that carried rejection, words spoken repeatedly that carried hopelessness. And he said these words form an invisible climate that affects everyone who lives there. He urged families to reclaim their homes intentionally, not by fear of demons, but by love of God, because fear focuses on darkness, while love strengthens light, and a home filled with blessing becomes naturally resistant to intrusion. Padre Pio believed that angels are attracted to humility, prayer, gratitude, and respect, and that these qualities are communicated daily through language, not only during prayer but during meals, disagreements, and ordinary conversations. He challenged parents and spouses to ask themselves not whether their words were justified, but whether they were fruitful, because justification often feeds pride, while fruitfulness serves love. He taught that a Christian home should sound different, not artificial or pious, but marked by restraint, encouragement, and hope, even in correction and discipline, because correction given with dignity instructs, while correction delivered with contempt crushes. This is why Padre Pio insisted that renewing a home spiritually often begins not with adding new prayers, but with removing destructive speech, because you cannot fill a space with blessing while constantly pouring poison into it. He invited families to make a conscious decision, especially at turning points in life, to guard their tongues as an act of love, not legalism, understanding that this discipline protects relationships, preserves peace, and opens space for grace to work quietly but powerfully. If this message resonates with you, stay connected and consider subscribing, because growth in faith happens through consistent reflection, not one-time inspiration. And as we continue, you will begin to see how specific words, often spoken without thought, can weaken the spiritual foundation of a home, and how replacing them with words of truth and blessing can restore what seemed lost, bringing peace not by magic, but by alignment with how God designed the human heart and the family to function. One of the most dangerous illusions Padre Pio warned against is the belief that words are harmless once they are spoken and forgotten, because in reality, words do not vanish. They echo, they settle into memory, they shape expectations, and they quietly teach everyone in the home what is acceptable and what is inevitable. And this is why he insisted that the tongue is not merely an instrument of communication, but an altar where sacrifices are constantly offered, either to God through praise and truth, or to the enemy through despair, contempt, and accusation. He observed that many families prayed sincerely, yet remained spiritually stagnant because their daily speech contradicted their prayers, asking God for peace while constantly speaking agitation, asking for unity while constantly voicing division, asking for protection while repeatedly declaring fear and failure. And he said this contradiction creates inner conflict that weakens faith from within. Padre Pio explained that the enemy rarely needs dramatic events to destabilize a home, because ordinary language repeated daily is far more effective, since repetition forms agreement, and agreement gives permission, and permission allows influence, which is why words spoken casually during stress or humor can be more destructive than words spoken intentionally in anger. He often warned that sarcasm is one of the most underestimated weapons against peace, because it disguises contempt as humor, making it socially acceptable to wound while pretending to joke. And over time, sarcasm teaches children and spouses that respect is optional and mockery is normal. This erosion of respect creates emotional distance, and emotional distance creates vulnerability to temptation, resentment, and isolation, all without any obvious scandal. He also emphasized that words spoken about oneself carry the same power as words spoken about others, because the soul listens to its own voice more than any other. And when a person constantly says, "I can't, I'm useless, nothing ever works for me," they are not describing reality. They are forming it, aligning their expectations with defeat rather than hope. Padre Pio said that the enemy loves self-directed negativity because it requires no opposition, no argument, no persecution, only repetition. And once a person believes their own negative declarations, they stop asking God for more. Not because God refuses, but because the heart no longer expects anything to change. He taught that hope is not optimism or denial of difficulty, but the habit of speaking truth rooted in God's promises, even when circumstances are hard, and that this habit must be practiced intentionally, especially in the home, where private speech reveals what public faith often hides. He noticed that many marital conflicts escalated not because of the original issue, but because of the language used to address it, words like always and never that turn a single mistake into a permanent identity, making reconciliation feel impossible and defensiveness inevitable. These absolute words, he warned, are spiritually dangerous because they deny the possibility of conversion, growth, and grace, placing a person in a fixed narrative that leaves no room for God to act. Padre Pio insisted that correction must always be specific and limited to the action, never extended to the person's worth, because once worth is attacked, the heart closes, and closed hearts cannot receive guidance or healing. He also spoke about the spiritual weight of complaining, explaining that while honest expression of pain can be healthy, habitual complaining trains the soul to focus on lack rather than providence, gradually dulling gratitude and making bitterness feel justified. He warned that a home saturated with complaint becomes spiritually heavy, not because suffering is ignored, but because suffering is never offered, never entrusted, never lifted beyond human frustration. This is why he encouraged families to replace complaint with petition, not silence, but transformation, bringing concerns to God instead of endlessly recycling them among themselves. He taught that even tone matters, because truth spoken with contempt wounds as deeply as lies spoken sweetly, and that holiness is not found only in what is said, but in how it is said with patience, humility, and restraint. Padre Pio often reminded parents that children learn how to speak to themselves by listening to how adults speak to them, and that a child constantly criticized learns to become their own harsh judge, carrying that voice into adulthood, prayer, and decision-making, often confusing that inner accusation with conscience or even God's voice. He warned that this internalized harshness can distort faith, making God seem distant, demanding, or impossible to please, which is why he urged parents to discipline firmly but bless generously, ensuring that correction never outweighs affirmation. He also spoke about the danger of joking curses, phrases spoken lightly like, "This house is cursed," or "We're doomed," which people excuse as exaggeration, but which, he said, plant seeds of agreement with despair, especially when repeated during stress, illness, or financial struggle. He insisted that even when spoken without belief, such words train the heart to expect loss, making perseverance harder when trials come. Padre Pio taught that spiritual authority begins in the home, and that parents who do not guard their speech unintentionally surrender that authority, allowing external voices, media, peers, and fear to shape their children more than faith does. He emphasized that reclaiming authority does not require shouting or control, but consistency, because consistent blessing rebuilds trust and consistency in speech rebuilds credibility. He also warned that words spoken during moments of exhaustion are particularly influential because fatigue lowers defenses, making it easier for negative speech to pass unchecked. And he encouraged families to establish habits of silence or prayer during these moments, rather than risk damage that later requires repair. Padre Pio believed deeply in the power of substitution, teaching that the goal is not merely to stop saying harmful words, but to replace them with life-giving ones, because nature abhors a vacuum, and silence without intention often fills again with the same patterns. He recommended simple practices, like consciously blessing the home each morning, speaking gratitude aloud during meals, and ending the day with words of forgiveness rather than unresolved tension. because these small acts reset the spiritual atmosphere daily. He taught that peace is maintained not by avoiding conflict, but by governing expression, ensuring that truth is always spoken in a way that preserves dignity and hope. If you are recognizing familiar patterns as you reflect on this, do not be discouraged, because awareness is the first step toward freedom, and freedom begins not with perfection, but with humility and perseverance. Stay engaged, reflect honestly, and remain open, because understanding the hidden power of words is not about fear or control, but about learning how God designed speech to protect, heal, and sanctify the place where love is meant to grow. And as we continue, you will see even more clearly how deliberate language transforms not only homes, but hearts, relationships, and faith itself. Padre Pio also warned that there is a subtle stage beyond insults and curses, where language becomes a constant confession of defeat. And he said this stage is often the most spiritually corrosive because it sounds reasonable, mature, even realistic, yet it slowly teaches a household to expect loss instead of grace. And this is where the enemy finds fertile ground to operate quietly without resistance. He observed that many people do not speak outright hatred or curses, yet they constantly repeat phrases that drain hope from the atmosphere. Statements like, "This will never change," "We've always been like this," "Nothing good lasts," or "There's no point trying." And while these phrases may feel like emotional honesty, Padre Pio said they are actually declarations that close the heart to God's action. He explained that despair is not only an emotion, but a posture of the soul, and words are what train that posture day after day, shaping how a family interprets events, challenges, and even blessings. When something good happens in a home shaped by despairing language, it is often dismissed as luck or temporary relief, while difficulties are treated as proof that failure is inevitable, and this imbalance creates spiritual exhaustion, because hope is never allowed to rest. Padre Pio taught that the enemy does not need to convince people that God does not exist. It is enough to convince them that God will not act for them, and this belief is most effectively planted through repeated verbal resignation. He warned especially against phrases spoken during hardship that frame suffering as meaningless or permanent, because suffering offered to God becomes redemptive, but suffering declared hopeless becomes corrosive, slowly turning pain into bitterness. He noticed that families trapped in this pattern often prayed less, not because they rejected prayer, but because they quietly stopped expecting answers, and prayer without expectation becomes routine rather than relationship. He said that language reveals faith more accurately than ritual, because people may kneel in church yet speak unbelief at home, and the soul always follows the voice it hears most often. Another form of speech Padre Pio identified as spiritually dangerous is constant accusation, not only toward others but toward circumstances, fate, or God himself. Expressions like, "God doesn't care," "God has favorites," or "God abandoned us," which he said are particularly harmful because they distort the image of God in the heart. Once God is perceived as distant or unfair, trust collapses, and without trust, obedience becomes heavy, prayer becomes forced, and faith becomes fragile. He reminded people that the enemy's first strategy in Scripture was accusation, not violence, because accusation divides the heart from God before anything else happens. Padre Pio taught that even when spoken in grief or confusion, accusatory language must be purified, not suppressed, redirected toward honest lament without blame, because God welcomes questions but resists accusations that deny his goodness. He often encouraged people to read the Psalms aloud at home, because the Psalms teach how to express pain without surrendering hope, sorrow without surrendering faith, and anger without surrendering love. He believed that homes that pray Scripture regularly develop a different vocabulary, one that names struggle while still anchoring it in trust. He also spoke about the danger of constant negative predictions, words that frame the future as something to fear rather than something entrusted to God. Phrases like, "Something bad is going to happen, I just know this will end badly," or "Don't get your hopes up," which he said slowly program anxiety into the home. Anxiety, he warned, thrives on verbal rehearsal, and every time fear is spoken aloud without being challenged by faith, it gains authority over the imagination. He observed that children raised in anxious language learn to scan the world for threats rather than possibilities, making them more vulnerable to control, addiction, and despair later in life. Padre Pio insisted that prudence is not fear, and realism is not pessimism, and that Christian speech must reflect vigilance without surrendering peace. He taught that when fear must be expressed, it should always be followed by trust, transforming "I'm afraid" into "I'm afraid, but God is with us," so that fear does not become the final word. Another category of spiritually damaging language he warned against is habitual gossip within the home, speaking constantly about the faults, failures, and scandals of others, even when those others are not present. He said, "Gossip creates a climate of judgment that eventually turns inward, because a household that feeds on criticism becomes suspicious, insecure, and defensive. Over time, gossip teaches children that worth is conditional and that mistakes define identity, making them afraid to be honest about their own struggles. Padre Pio taught that gossip is rarely motivated by concern and almost always by the desire to feel superior or distracted from one's own wounds. And he warned that homes saturated with gossip lose the ability to see goodness clearly, because attention is trained on what is broken rather than what is being redeemed. He encouraged families to replace gossip with intercession, saying that if something concerns you enough to speak about it, it concerns you enough to pray about it, and prayer transforms curiosity into compassion. He also spoke strongly about the spiritual damage caused by constant complaining about one another, spouses criticizing spouses, parents criticizing children, siblings criticizing siblings, not in moments of correction, but as a habitual tone. He said, "This creates an environment where love feels conditional and acceptance feels fragile, making everyone emotionally guarded. Guarded hearts," he warned, "are fertile ground for isolation, secrecy, and temptation, because when people feel judged at home, they seek refuge elsewhere." Padre Pio taught that encouragement is not indulgence, and affirmation is not denial of flaws, but nourishment for the soul that makes growth possible. He insisted that a single sincere word of affirmation, spoken consistently, can undo years of damage caused by careless criticism, but only if it is repeated enough to rebuild trust. He often reminded people that the tongue is small, but its influence is immense, and that spiritual renewal in a home almost always begins not with dramatic prayer campaigns, but with quiet changes in speech. If you are listening and beginning to notice patterns in your own words or in the atmosphere of your home, do not turn this into self-accusation, because condemnation freezes growth, but let it become awareness that leads to choice. Stay attentive, stay patient, and stay engaged, because learning to sanctify language is not about becoming silent or fearful of speech, but about becoming intentional, truthful, and aligned with the life God desires for your family. And as this understanding deepens, you will see how the words you choose each day either reinforce old chains or quietly open doors to freedom, peace, and grace that have been waiting all along. Padre Pio went even further and warned that beyond despairing language, accusatory speech, and habitual negativity, there exists a quieter and more socially accepted form of verbal danger that slowly dismantles the spiritual structure of a home, and that is the language of mockery and sarcasm. He said, "Sarcasm is especially deceptive because it disguises cruelty as humor and contempt as intelligence, allowing harshness to pass unnoticed and unrepented." In many homes, sarcasm becomes the default tone of communication. Spouses speaking to each other with cutting jokes, parents correcting children with ridicule, siblings hiding resentment behind laughter. And over time, this tone erodes safety because people stop knowing whether words are meant to build or to wound. Padre Pio taught that the soul cannot fully relax in an atmosphere where love is expressed through irony rather than tenderness, because irony always keeps emotional distance, and distance is where division grows. He observed that sarcasm teaches people to defend themselves emotionally, even in moments that require vulnerability, and a defended heart is less open to grace. He said that when a family laughs at one another's weaknesses rather than protecting them, those weaknesses harden into shame, and shame, once planted, becomes one of the enemy's most reliable tools. He also warned against habitual exaggeration in speech, especially exaggeration of faults, failures, and conflicts, because exaggeration distorts reality and trains the mind to perceive everything as worse than it truly is. When small problems are described as disasters and ordinary struggles are framed as catastrophes, the nervous system stays in constant alert and the spiritual life suffers because peace becomes unfamiliar. Padre Pio believed that peace is not only a gift from God, but a skill learned through trust, and language either trains that trust or undermines it. He noticed that homes dominated by exaggerated speech often experience emotional volatility, sudden anger, sudden despair, sudden discouragement, because words have trained emotions to overreact. Another form of speech he warned about is constant self-deprecation. Words spoken against oneself like, "I'm useless, I always mess things up, I'm a burden," which many people think are signs of humility, but which Padre Pio identified as hidden pride and hidden despair. True humility, he taught, acknowledges weakness while trusting God's power, but self-contempt denies the Creator's work and subtly agrees with the enemy's accusations. When a parent speaks this way about themselves, children absorb it as a model, learning to define themselves by failure rather than by grace. He said that self-directed negativity pollutes the home just as much as insults directed at others, because the atmosphere is shaped by every spoken word, regardless of its target. He also cautioned against constant expressions of impatience, phrases like, "Hurry up, you're too slow, you're wasting time," because impatience teaches that people are valued for efficiency rather than presence. Over time, this creates anxiety, especially in children, who begin to associate love with performance. Padre Pio believed that impatience is one of the quickest ways to drive God out of daily life, because God moves at the pace of love, not urgency, and when everything is rushed, prayer becomes inconvenient and presence becomes rare. He often reminded people that Jesus never hurried, even when crowds pressed in on him, and that homes patterned after Christ must learn to slow their speech before they can slow their hearts. Another dangerous verbal habit he identified is the casual normalization of sin through language, speaking about wrongdoing lightly, joking about immorality, or minimizing harmful behavior with phrases like, "Everyone does it," or "It's not that bad." He warned that language shapes conscience, and when sin is softened verbally, it loses its weight morally, making repentance less urgent and conversion less likely. This does not mean living in constant guilt, but it does mean naming things truthfully, without mockery or dismissal, so that grace has something real to heal. Padre Pio also spoke about the damage caused by constant comparison in speech, especially within families. Phrases like, "Why can't you be like your brother?" "Other families don't have these problems," or "When I was your age, I did better," because comparison replaces personal vocation with competition. He taught that God does not create duplicates, and that comparison is an insult to divine creativity. In homes where comparison dominates, jealousy grows quietly, resentment accumulates, and unity fractures, even when everyone claims to want the best for one another. He insisted that encouragement must be specific and personal, recognizing each person's unique gifts rather than measuring them against others. He also warned about speech that constantly reopens past wounds, repeatedly bringing up old failures, past mistakes, or forgiven sins during arguments, because this trains the heart to live backward rather than forward. When the past is weaponized verbally, forgiveness becomes fragile and trust becomes conditional. Padre Pio taught that forgiveness spoken once must be protected by silence afterward, because forgiven sins lose power only when they are no longer rehearsed. Another subtle form of harmful speech he identified is false reassurance, telling people everything is fine when it is not, or don't worry, without offering presents or prayer, because this invalidates real pain and teaches emotional isolation. He said that authentic comfort names suffering honestly while walking with it toward God, rather than dismissing it with shallow optimism. Padre Pio believed that homes become spiritually strong, not when they avoid difficult conversations, but when they learn to speak truth gently, courageously, and faithfully. If you are recognizing some of these patterns in your own home, this awareness is not meant to discourage you, but to awaken you, because transformation begins not with perfection, but with attention. Stay present, stay reflective, and stay open, because learning to guard the tongue is learning to guard the heart, and a guarded heart, when guarded with love rather than fear, becomes a place where God delights to dwell, restore, and quietly transform everything from the inside out. Padre Pio taught that after mockery, exaggeration, self-contempt, impatience, and careless comparison, there remains another layer of language that quietly corrodes a home from within, and that is the language of hopeless prediction. These are words spoken not in anger, but in resignation. Phrases like, "This will never change," "That's just how our family is," "Things always end badly for us," or "Nothing ever works out." He warned that these words are especially dangerous because they sound realistic, mature, and even wise, yet spiritually they function as declarations that imprison the future. Padre Pio understood that despair does not always scream. Often it whispers calmly and convinces people that expecting less is a form of protection. In reality, these words train the soul to stop waiting for God. When hope is verbally withdrawn, faith slowly suffocates, because faith requires expectation, even when circumstances appear unchanged. He said that the devil loves hopeless language because it costs nothing emotionally to speak and requires no visible sin, yet it gradually seals doors that prayer is trying to open. In homes where hopeless predictions are common, people stop dreaming, stop asking, stop trusting, and eventually stop praying with real desire, because prayer without hope becomes ritual rather than relationship. Padre Pio insisted that even when circumstances are objectively difficult, words must leave space for God to act, because God often works precisely where human logic sees no possibility. He reminded people that Abraham was called righteous, not because his situation made sense, but because his words and actions aligned with trust rather than probability. Another form of damaging speech he identified is constant complaint, especially complaint disguised as conversation. Complaining about weather, money, health, work, family members, or life in general trains the mind to scan for what is wrong rather than what is given. Padre Pio said complaint dulls gratitude, and gratitude is the doorway through which grace enters daily life. A home filled with complaint may still function outwardly, but inwardly it becomes heavy, because nothing is ever enough and nothing is ever received as gift. He taught that demons cannot endure gratitude, not because gratitude is loud, but because it acknowledges dependence on God. Complaining does the opposite, focusing attention on lack and injustice rather than provision and mercy. He noticed that families who complain together bond temporarily through shared frustration, but over time, that bond turns brittle, because negativity eventually turns inward, and people begin resenting one another for the very circumstances they once lamented together. He also warned about the language of suspicion, constantly questioning motives, assuming bad intentions, saying things like, "You did that on purpose, I know what you're really thinking," or "You always have an angle." This kind of speech poisons trust and teaches people to defend themselves rather than open themselves. Padre Pio believed that trust is essential for spiritual growth because God asks the soul to surrender, and a soul trained in suspicion struggles to surrender without fear. In homes where suspicion dominates, even acts of kindness are questioned, and love becomes conditional. He also spoke about the destructive power of repeated negative storytelling, constantly retelling painful events, humiliations, betrayals, or injustices in vivid detail, not for healing, but for reinforcement. While sharing pain is necessary, Padre Pio distinguished between testimony and rumination. Testimony brings pain into the light to seek grace, while rumination reopens wounds to keep them alive. He warned that constantly rehearsing pain verbally can anchor the soul to the moment of injury, preventing movement forward. The enemy uses this pattern to keep families emotionally stuck, reliving old hurts rather than building new trust. Another subtle danger he identified is speech that replaces prayer, constantly analyzing problems, discussing solutions endlessly, but never turning them over to God. Padre Pio observed that people often talk about their problems far more than they pray about them, and over time, this imbalance trains the mind to rely on control rather than surrender. Words meant to solve everything become a substitute for faith, and the home becomes a planning room rather than a sanctuary. He did not discourage discussion, but insisted that every serious conversation must eventually kneel before God, otherwise human effort exhausts itself. He also warned against habitual negativity spoken jokingly, phrases like, "Of course this happened to us, we're cursed," or "That's our luck," even when said lightly. He said the spiritual realm does not interpret tone, only agreement. Jokes that align with despair still function as agreement with despair. He taught that words shape inner orientation, and repeated negativity trains the heart to expect misfortune rather than mercy. Another pattern he cautioned against is the refusal to speak blessing, especially between spouses and parents and children. Silence where encouragement should exist becomes fertile ground for insecurity. He said that many people assume love is understood and therefore need not be spoken, but unspoken love weakens over time because the human heart needs confirmation. Words of affirmation are not indulgent, they are stabilizing. Without them, people begin seeking validation elsewhere, sometimes in destructive ways. Padre Pio insisted that blessing spoken aloud strengthens identity and anchors people emotionally. He also warned against speech that trivializes spiritual life, mocking prayer, minimizing devotion, or treating faith as a private eccentricity rather than a shared foundation. In homes where faith is verbally sidelined, it slowly becomes practically irrelevant, and God is invited only in emergencies rather than daily life. He believed that reverence must be protected verbally before it can be protected behaviorally. If you recognize these patterns, remember that awareness is already grace at work. Change does not require perfection, only intention and perseverance. Begin by choosing one area of speech to transform, one habit to replace with blessing, one sentence to reshape with hope. Padre Pio taught that God works patiently, not dramatically, and that consistent small changes create lasting spiritual climates. As words become more intentional, hearts soften, trust rebuilds, and peace gradually returns. This is not psychological manipulation, but spiritual cooperation, because language is one of the primary ways the soul participates in its own formation. A home that learns to speak with hope, gratitude, trust, blessing, and reverence becomes a place where God feels welcome and where darkness finds no comfortable place to remain. Padre Pio went even deeper by explaining that beyond obvious harsh words and visible negativity, there exists a subtler form of speech that quietly weakens a home, and that is the language of spiritual indifference. These are words that sound neutral, reasonable, even calm. Phrases like, "It doesn't really matter," "God understands, so it's fine," "Everyone does it," or "Faith is personal," Let's not take it too seriously. He warned that indifference is often more dangerous than open rebellion because it slowly anesthetizes the conscience without triggering alarm. When sacred things are spoken of casually, when prayer is treated as optional commentary rather than lifeline, the soul begins to drift without realizing it is moving. Padre Pio saw that many homes did not fall into spiritual trouble because of hatred or curses, but because of slow neglect reinforced by language that minimized the importance of God. He taught that what we repeatedly describe as unimportant eventually loses its power over us, and once God is verbally reduced to a background presence, other influences quietly move into the center. He also warned strongly against habitual sarcasm, especially sarcasm aimed at faith, family roles, or personal effort. Sarcasm trains the tongue to wound while pretending to entertain, and Padre Pio said demons love sarcasm because it allows cruelty to wear a mask of humor. In homes where sarcasm dominates, sincerity becomes risky, vulnerability is punished, and people learn to protect themselves through emotional distance. Over time, this creates isolation even when people live under the same roof. He observed that sarcasm often replaces honest conversation because it feels safer to mock than to admit fear, hope, or need. Another pattern he identified was the repeated use of absolutist language, words like always, never, everyone, or no one, especially during conflict. Statements like, "You always mess things up," "You never listen," or "No one cares about me," may express frustration, but spiritually they function as exaggerations that distort reality and inflame division. Padre Pio said these words close doors to reconciliation because they deny the possibility of change. When someone is verbally trapped in an identity of always or never, hope for transformation is removed and the relationship hardens. He taught that truth must be spoken with precision and charity, not emotional overreach, because exaggeration becomes a tool of division rather than healing. He also spoke about the danger of self-erasing language, phrases like, "I'm nothing," "I don't matter," "It doesn't matter what happens to me," often spoken by people who believe they are being humble. Padre Pio made a sharp distinction between humility and self-contempt. True humility acknowledges dependence on God while honoring the dignity God gives, whereas self-contempt denies God's work in the soul. He warned that repeatedly diminishing oneself verbally is not virtue, but agreement with the enemy's accusation that a person has no value. In homes where self-erasing language is common, children learn to undervalue themselves, spouses learn to accept neglect, and suffering is normalized rather than addressed. Padre Pio insisted that every person has the duty to protect the dignity God has placed within them, and that dignity is reinforced or weakened by the words spoken about oneself. He also cautioned against language that glorifies exhaustion, sacrifice without boundaries, or constant martyrdom. Phrases like, "I have to do everything myself," "No one helps me, I'll just suffer through it," which can sound noble but often conceal resentment. He said that unspoken resentment eventually leaks out through bitterness, passive aggression, or sudden anger, poisoning the atmosphere of the home. God does not ask for silent self-destruction, and Padre Pio taught that honest communication rooted in charity is healthier than heroic silence that breeds resentment. Another category he warned about is the language of comparison, especially within families. Statements like, "Why can't you be like your brother?" "Other families don't have these problems," or "Look how successful they are compared to us." Comparison fractures identity and breeds envy, and Padre Pio said, envy is one of the quickest ways to lose interior peace because it shifts focus from gratitude to competition. In homes where comparison is common, love becomes conditional, and people feel valued only when they outperform someone else. He taught that God deals uniquely with each soul, and comparing paths is a refusal to trust divine wisdom. He also addressed the danger of speaking fear constantly, even when danger is hypothetical. Words like, "Something bad is going to happen," "I feel like this won't end well," or "We should prepare for the worst," spoken repeatedly, train the mind to live in anticipation of disaster. Padre Pio acknowledged that prudence is necessary, but fear-based language that dominates daily conversation becomes an invitation to anxiety rather than preparation. He said fear narrows the soul's vision, making it difficult to perceive God's guidance because fear focuses on imagined outcomes rather than present grace. In homes saturated with fearful speech, children grow hypervigilant, adults become controlling, and trust in God erodes quietly. He also warned against gossip within the home, speaking ill of others behind their backs, even casually. Gossip fractures charity and teaches the tongue to judge rather than intercede. Padre Pio said that when we speak negatively about others, even absent ones, we train the heart toward condemnation rather than mercy, and that spirit eventually turns inward, leading people to judge themselves harshly as well. He believed that words spoken in private shape the soul just as much as words spoken publicly, because God hears both equally. Finally, Padre Pio emphasized that transformation begins not by policing every sentence perfectly, but by cultivating awareness and intention. He encouraged families to consecrate their speech daily, even with a simple prayer, asking God to guard their tongues and purify their words. He taught that when people consciously choose to bless rather than diminish, encourage rather than accuse, hope rather than despair, the spiritual climate of a home changes gradually but deeply. Words are not neutral, they are carriers of direction. Spoken repeatedly, they become pathways the soul walks daily. A home that learns to speak with reverence, honesty, courage, and charity becomes resilient, because even conflict is handled with respect, and even pain is brought before God, rather than weaponized against one another. Padre Pio believed that such homes become places of quiet resistance against darkness, not because they are perfect, but because they are oriented toward light. Padre Pio taught that once a family becomes aware of the destructive power of certain words, the next decisive step is learning how to actively reconsecrate speech, because silence alone is not enough. Removing poisonous language creates an empty space, and if that space is not intentionally filled with words of life, something else will occupy it. He warned that many families stop saying harmful things, but never replace them with blessings, encouragement, prayer, and truth. And as a result, the atmosphere improves briefly, but eventually returns to tension. According to Padre Pio, the tongue is not just something to restrain, it is something to train. He believed that speech must be disciplined like a muscle, exercised daily toward goodness, because whatever is practiced becomes natural over time. This is why he insisted that families develop the habit of speaking blessings out loud, not just thinking them. He said a blessing spoken audibly has a different spiritual weight than a good intention kept silent, because spoken words engage the will, the body, and the soul together. He encouraged parents to bless their children verbally every day, even with simple phrases like, "God is with you," "You are protected," "You are capable," "You are loved," because these words form an inner shield that protects young hearts from external voices of accusation and temptation. He observed that children who grow up hearing blessings regularly develop an interior stability that remains even when they face criticism, failure, or rejection later in life. Padre Pio also emphasized the importance of blessing during conflict, which sounds impossible to many people, but he insisted it was one of the most powerful forms of spiritual warfare. He taught that when anger rises and the impulse is to accuse or wound, choosing to speak a restrained, respectful word instead deprives the enemy of momentum. This does not mean denying pain or pretending everything is fine, but it means expressing truth without cruelty. He used to say that truth spoken without love becomes a weapon, while love spoken without truth becomes weakness, and families must learn to unite both. He encouraged replacing accusations like, "You ruined everything," with responsibility statements such as, "This hurt me deeply," because the first assigns identity while the second communicates experience. Identity-attacking language locks people into defensive positions, while experience-based language opens the possibility of repentance and reconciliation. Padre Pio believed many homes remain stuck, not because problems are unsolvable, but because language keeps reopening the same wounds instead of allowing them to heal. Another practice he recommended was intentional verbal gratitude, especially in ordinary moments. He noticed that many families only speak passionately during conflict, while everyday goodness goes unacknowledged. Over time, this creates an emotional economy where negativity receives attention and positivity is taken for granted. Padre Pio warned that this imbalance trains the soul to associate intensity with conflict rather than connection. He encouraged families to speak gratitude for small things, meals, efforts, patience, presence, because gratitude anchors the heart in reality rather than resentment. He believed that gratitude spoken aloud strengthens humility, not humiliation, because it recognizes goodness without comparison. He also insisted that families must stop using prayer language only in formal settings while allowing destructive language elsewhere. A home that prays beautifully but speaks harshly the rest of the day sends contradictory signals to the soul. Padre Pio taught that consistency matters more than eloquence, and that a simple prayer spoken sincerely is more powerful than many words recited without interior alignment. He encouraged families to sanctify transitional moments with speech, such as leaving the house, beginning work, starting a meal, or going to sleep, by invoking God's presence briefly. These short-spoken invocations act like spiritual stitching, holding the day together and preventing fragmentation. He also warned about the danger of speaking despair during hardship. Words like, "This will never end," "We can't survive this," or "There's no hope left," may express exhaustion, but Padre Pio said they reinforce hopelessness rather than relieve it. He acknowledged suffering deeply, but he insisted that suffering must be placed within a horizon of meaning. He taught that when families learn to say, "This is hard, but God is still here," they protect themselves from collapsing inward. Hope, for Padre Pio, was not denial of pain, but refusal to absolutize it. He believed that hope spoken aloud keeps the soul oriented toward God, even when emotions lag behind. Another area he addressed was how families speak about the future. Constantly predicting failure or disaster conditions the heart to expect disappointment, while constantly fantasizing without grounding creates instability. He encouraged balanced speech that entrusted the future to God without either fear or illusion. He often reminded people that tomorrow belongs to God, not to anxiety or control, and that verbally surrendering outcomes brings peace even when circumstances remain uncertain. Padre Pio also emphasized the importance of repairing language after it has caused harm. He taught that apologies must be specific and sincere, not vague or dismissive. Saying, "I'm sorry if you felt hurt," does not heal the same way as, "I'm sorry for what I said, it was wrong." He believed that repair is essential because words linger even after forgiveness is offered. Taking responsibility for harmful speech restores trust and models humility, especially for children who learn how to handle their own mistakes by observing adults. He also encouraged families to pray together, specifically for purification of speech, asking God to heal the damage caused by past words. He believed that God's grace could restore even deeply wounded family dynamics when there was honesty and perseverance. Ultimately, Padre Pio taught that a home becomes spiritually strong, not because it never struggles, but because it learns to struggle without destroying itself through language. Words can either turn conflict into a battlefield or into a place of growth. He insisted that every family has the capacity to transform its atmosphere, not through perfection, but through intention, vigilance, and grace. When families commit to speaking with reverence, truth, and mercy, the home gradually becomes a place where peace is not forced, but cultivated. And according to Padre Pio, such a home becomes a quiet fortress, one where darkness finds no welcome, not because evil never knocks, but because the door is consistently answered with light. Padre Pio taught that the final and most decisive transformation of a home does not happen when people merely understand the danger of destructive words, but when they make a conscious covenant to guard their speech every day, especially in moments when it costs them something. He believed that the tongue reveals what rules the heart, and that lasting change begins when families decide who will be Lord of their inner life. According to him, many people pray for peace while continuing to speak in ways that sabotage that very prayer, and then wonder why nothing changes. He insisted that God's grace is never lacking, but human cooperation often is. Words are one of the primary ways we cooperate with or resist grace. When a home chooses to speak life consistently, even imperfectly, it begins to experience a gradual but undeniable shift. Arguments lose their violence, silence becomes less threatening, and even unresolved problems stop poisoning the atmosphere. Padre Pio observed that evil thrives in chaos, confusion, and verbal aggression, but retreats where clarity, humility, and blessing take root. He taught that families must stop treating speech as casual and start treating it as sacred stewardship. Every word spoken in the home either builds an altar or digs a pit. There is no neutral ground. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It means that peace is not something we wait for, but something we choose daily through discipline and intention. Padre Pio never promised that guarding one's tongue would eliminate suffering, but he promised it would prevent unnecessary suffering, the kind created by cruelty, contempt, and despair spoken aloud. He warned that many families suffer twice, once from the problem itself and once from how they talk about it. When words become weapons, wounds multiply. When words become prayers, wounds begin to heal. He emphasized that sanctifying speech is not about becoming artificial or suppressing emotion. It is about learning to express even anger, grief, and disappointment without surrendering dignity or charity. He believed that strong families are not those without conflict, but those who refuse to let conflict strip away love. Another key teaching he emphasized was perseverance. Changing the culture of speech in a home does not happen overnight. Old habits resist change, and moments of fatigue will cause regression. Padre Pio warned people not to despair when they fail, because despair itself often becomes an excuse to stop trying. He taught that every effort counts, even when imperfect, and that grace builds slowly but firmly. He encouraged people to return again and again to the commitment to speak life, just as one returns again and again to prayer. He often compared this process to healing a deep wound, saying that it must be cleaned repeatedly before it closes, and that reopening it through harsh words delays recovery. He also stressed the importance of example. Children and spouses learn more from what they hear regularly than from occasional lectures. A parent who speaks respectfully, even when angry, teaches more about virtue than 1,000 instructions. A spouse who chooses restraint over insult teaches trust without words. Padre Pio believed that the greatest gift parents give their children is not comfort or success, but a stable interior environment where words do not wound unpredictably. He also addressed the spiritual protection that flows naturally from sanctified speech. He taught that homes marked by blessing become places where prayer is easier, forgiveness comes more quickly, and fear has less power. He believed that angels are drawn to environments where God is honored not only in prayer, but in daily language. Conversely, he warned that persistent verbal negativity weakens spiritual defenses and leaves families vulnerable to discouragement, division, and despair. He insisted that many spiritual attacks begin not with dramatic events, but with slow erosion through constant negative speech. The good news, he said, is that the same mouth that invited darkness can invite light, often faster than people expect. One sincere act of repentance, followed by consistent effort, can begin a chain reaction of restoration. Padre Pio often reminded people that God is more eager to heal than we are to change, and that even small steps taken in faith matter greatly. He encouraged families to consecrate their speech explicitly to God, asking him to place a guard over their lips and to teach them when to speak and when to remain silent. Silence, he taught, is not weakness when it protects charity, but wisdom. He also encouraged the practice of ending each day with a brief examination of words spoken, not to condemn oneself, but to learn. Which words brought peace? Which stirred conflict? Which could have been said differently? This gentle review trains the conscience without crushing the spirit. He believed that awareness is the beginning of freedom. Over time, families who practice this begin to notice patterns, triggers, and growth. Gradually, speech becomes more intentional, less reactive. The home becomes less volatile, more grounded. Padre Pio also spoke about the redemptive power of blessing even those who hurt us, especially within the family. He acknowledged that this is one of the hardest teachings of the gospel, but also one of the most liberating. Blessing does not excuse wrongdoing, but it frees the heart from captivity to bitterness. He believed that blessing an offender verbally, even privately, breaks chains that nothing else can. In the end, Padre Pio's message about words was simple but demanding. Choose life. Choose it daily. Choose it when it feels unnatural. Choose it when emotions scream otherwise. Because words shape reality, not by magic, but by cooperation with truth or with lies. A home that chooses life with its words becomes a place where God is not only invited, but welcomed, where wounds are not denied, but healed, and where even suffering is carried with dignity and hope. Padre Pio believed that such homes become lights in a dark world, not because they are perfect, but because they are honest, humble, and anchored in God. The final invitation he left was clear. Begin today. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Do not wait until emotions settle. Begin with one word of blessing, one restrained response, one refusal to curse. Over time, these small acts form a new language, and that language forms a new atmosphere. And in that atmosphere, God can finally dwell freely.